interview Mark Strand, the poet in this book, and he says that it's the responsibility of the poetry reader to prepare oneself, to create space to absorb the poem and let it swirl around and generate the ideas that it will generate. You say, reasonably enough, oh, well, maybe I'm just the wrong person to be reading this. Do you think we do ask? I mean, it raises some questions about how do we communicate important things. We fight that all the time in the media. How do we make things both entertaining and intelligent, challenge people but not turn them off? Did you get any wiser after that conversation with Mark?
Well, I suppose he encouraged my worst tendencies, really, because he basically says, you know, he doesn't even understand some of his own poems. He says, give yourself the right to write something that you find interesting or truthful, and it's up to everybody else to go at least halfway to meet it. And, of course, I have written mostly for theater, where that would be an unthinkable piece of advice. But I've gone fairly far in doing that. In theater, most of the time you're supposed to write so that a person sees the play once and completely understands it. Whereas many of my plays, let's face it, you have to see them 2 or 3 times.
And if you come out with questions, it's good. Well, that takes me to the conversation we were just having before you joined us, which has to do with important stuff like healthcare reform. And you have what should be a pretty rational, clear-cut case. Change is needed. There needs to be an alternative to profit-driven care. It's an argument that has a lot of support, and yet it's losing ground. How do you explain it? Are we not being smart enough about how we communicate?
Well, I wouldn't begin by talking about the communication problem. I mean, I think the healthcare debate is a fascinating and horrible example of the fact that more or less, as in the Chinese case, there's a small elite that runs our country. In the Chinese case, they call it the Communist Party. And here, it's a bunch of businessmen that you and I have never even met. And, supposedly President Obama in the old days agreed there should be a government-run health system, and most people out in the street feel that. And yet it's described as completely impossible because the dictators who really run this country don't want it. Now, who are those dictators and who is that elite? We don't even know them. But they're not even discussed on television. When you see the news, you see a bunch of congressmen and you see the president, but these people are not really running the country. They're just the people who are on television. So, of course, one of the means used by this elite is propaganda. And, one of the other means is bribery, and the members of the Congress and possibly the president being unable to disobey the rulers because the rulers have financed them and are their backers. But there's also the public, a large proportion of whom are living in a world of fantasy that's been purposely created to delude them.
It sounds like a Brechtian or a Wally Shavian play, frankly. Talk about whether you think it's a tragedy. I mean, is there a way out? Can we turn the tables?
Well, let's try. I mean, I think it's a hard struggle. I mean, Marx was quite clever in explaining that the people who have the money in a society usually have most of the power. Yeah. But in a kind of technical sense, this still is a democracy, and that fact could be exploited if people were ready to exploit it, to throw out the congressmen who were beholden to the, health insurance industry or the drug industry, and to put in people who genuinely would represent them. But that would require that instead of being bribed by those companies, we would have to give them the money, and we would have to bribe them ourselves, and we would have to agitate against them. Unfortunately, when the health proposals are themselves already so compromised, it's hard to drum up incredible enthusiasm behind them.
Is, in this circumstance, or generally, do you think, the perfect the enemy of the good? You hear that a lot, particularly from people a little less idealistic, a little more close to the center of power in Washington. They say, well, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What do you say?
Well, really, the good doesn't usually get incrementally better and better. Many of the beneficial changes in the world happen with quite a brutal suddenness, such as, the freeing of the slaves happened overnight. I think that, would the healthcare industry give up its power bit by bit? I'm not sure. I think sometimes striving for the perfect is more practical.
Where's the place for fate in your worldview? That fate is about, if fate means that the future is predetermined, I don't think I believe that. I think fate is it's sometimes valuable for an individual to accept what his lot is and live in the moment. If you're exploited and oppressed, it's probably not a good idea. Wallace Shawn, those thoughts and more, including an interview with Noam Chomsky, Mark Strand, and a whole lot more in essays. It's just out in this beautiful pocket edition from Haymarket Press. I'm so happy always to spend time with you in the studio.
Thank you. So great to be here.
Wallace Shawn, you're watching GRITtv.